And I realized that it's been a little over 3 years since I last talked about Quantum Leap on the show, and that is way too long to wait for one of my favorite franchises. I know. Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. It's been some time since I talked about it, but I still love Quantum Leap. It's a great show with interesting stories, fascinating characters, and cool sci-fi concepts, all while remaining a grounded show that was ultimately more about the individual settings and characters rather than the broad concept. We've talked about it before, but I always end up getting back into it every couple of years. Every time I remember how truly awesome it is. And like always, it leads into me doing a review. Although this isn't out of obligation or anything, or me spinning my wheels because I feel like I should be doing these. It's because the book that I read this year was so awesome that I just pushed it to the front of the line so that I could talk about how awesome it is. If you need backstory, which I know what I said in the last video, if you don't know what Quantum Leap is, Google it. This is like my third or fourth Quantum Leap video. I don't think I'm allowed to give a crash course on it anymore. You should know by now. But honestly, I'm starting to blank on the story of the show, so I need the refresher too. Quantum Leap is the story of Dr. Sam Beckett, a scientific genius who theorized a way to time travel within his own lifetime. That is to say, if you imagine all the points of your life as points on a string, you can ball the string up and fold it and access earlier points in your life because all of the bits of the string would be touching each other, so you could essentially leap to any point that was touching, and you would time travel by going hopscotching backwards on your timeline. Essentially, you can time travel to any point in the past up to the date of your birth. Some exceptions may apply, though. Sam was working on developing the project with the aid of U.S. government grants, but when the money dried up, he was required to provide results, which caused Sam to activate the Quantum Leap Accelerator early, which caused him to time travel, but as a result, his time-traveling ability was hijacked by God, time, fate, or whatever. So instead of reaching points in Sam's own life, he is instead placed into other people's lives for the purposes of putting right what once went wrong. Think of it as short-term reincarnation, like Airbnb but for living other people's lives. Every episode, Sam becomes another person, fixes an event in their life, and moves on, with each episode usually ending on a cliffhanger depicting the next episode's premise. What makes it interesting is that Sam's memory has been Swiss cheesed, so he has massive holes in it that prevent him from utilizing future knowledge or his advanced intellect too much, because otherwise it would be pretty easy to solve all the problems. But it also means he doesn't remember a lot about his own life unless he's told about it, and there are some that theorize that it's Sam's own innate desire to help people that motivate the leaps and not some unknown force. But it's left ambiguous for the most part. But Sam isn't alone on his quixotic quest to save everyone in existence, because he has his project team at his disposal, although the only member of that who appears regularly is Rear Admiral Al Calavici, Sam's Sancho Panza, and closest friend and confidant. He has the ability to become an insubstantial hologram that only Sam can see and hear to relay information that Ziggy, the main computer with an ego the size of the planet, and the rest of Project Quantum Leap discover about Sam's missions, since it's never a sure thing, just probability, based on available historical data and Ziggy's expert predictions. Other members of the team who appear sporadically across the 5 seasons include head computer programmer Gushy, a little guy with bad breath who works on Ziggy, Dr. Verbena Beeks, project psychiatrist who helps Sam's host cope, since while Sam takes over their life, they take over his in the future, and it takes a mental toll. and Tina Martinez, a medical technician and on-again off-again flaying of Al. The final piece of the puzzle, and only really relevant for the purposes of this particular novel, is that in the second episode, Starcrossed, Sam directly interfered in his own timeline by helping a young woman named Donna Elise reunite with her father. Since her father walking out on her caused major commitment issues, that resulted in her leaving her future fiancé at the altar years later, that future fiancé ending up being Sam. And in the revised history, Sam and Donna married, but Sam doesn't remember because Swiss cheese memory, and because many of the leaps include Sam becoming people in romantic entanglements of their own, Al is forbidden from telling Sam about his marriage, although Sam temporarily became aware of it when he and Al swapped places for a bit in Season 4's The Leap Back. Today's novel, Knights of the Morningstar, was released in 1994, a little under a year after the end of the series, which makes sense since many of the concepts in it that it draws upon come from the final season, particularly the fact that it features Alia and Zoe, Sam and Al's evil analogues, from the creatively named Evil Leaper project. Although, to be fair, I'm pretty sure it's not their official name, that's just what Sam and Al call it. Brief backstory for that, since it's fairly relevant. In the 5th season episode, Deliver Us from Evil, Sam finds himself leaped back in the life of Jimmy LaMotta, a man in the 60s with Down syndrome, who Sam had previously helped get a job and prevented Jimmy's brother Frank from institutionalizing him in the Season 2 episode Jimmy. For some reason, Jimmy's secured future was rewritten because of the evil leaper Alia leaping into Frank's wife Connie and destroying their marriage, which Sam prevented, but Alia and Zoe were punished by their computer Lothos for their failure. Sam's relationship with Alia is complicated because she gave him a whole sob story and Sam fell for it because it's not often he meets someone who knows exactly what he's going through, and he likes to look for the best in people, but she turned on a dime when it became time for her to complete her mission. It gets more complex the next time she appeared, later in the season, but as this novel takes place in between those two episodes, I'll refrain from including too many spoilers. Additionally, while it's not super relevant, I want to mention it anyway. Zoe, Alia's hologram, is played by the incomparable Carolyn Seymour, who, in addition to having another role in an earlier season, also appeared several times in Star Trek, most notably as Commander Taris of the Romulans, and she's been a pretty major voice for Big Finish Productions, appearing in several audio dramas across their lines. And if I may take a moment to go off topic even more, provided a brilliant performance in the first War Doctor box set, The Innocent. Anyway, I think that's all the backstory that's necessary. I know it was a lot. So, let's leap into Quantum Leap, Knights of the Morningstar. The cover is pretty similar to all the other Quantum Leap novels, unsurprising since the art was done by Keith Birdsong, who did all the other Quantum Leap novels I've looked at on the show previously, but this one is fairly interesting because instead of some vague, background or a weird image, this one has Sam in medieval armor and brandishing a sword, Al behind him on the right, and a woman on the left in medieval garb as well, who we'll later learn is Cynthia. Not that one, it's spelled differently. And then there's the Black Knight from Monty Python and the Holy Grail looming behind them. And given that he's just ahead, I would say that tracks pretty well with how that scene ended.
Alright, we'll call it a draw.
Up top, we've got the Quantum Leap logo and the title, along with the tagline that it's an all-new original novel based on the smash hit TV series. And the back cover proclaims that it's by Melanie Ron, best-selling author of the Dragon Prince series.
Greetings, fella humans, human fellas.
Unfortunately for fans of the Dragon Prince, not that one. This one is an unrelated set of fantasy novels from the late 80s, which makes sense given that the premise of this novel involves medieval concepts. What's also pretty nice is that the book is dedicated to both Quantum Leap fans who never believed that Sam never returned home, which was a crap end card, and to Scott Bakula and Dean Stockwell on behalf of fangirls everywhere. Anyway, let's begin. Like most of the novels, this one opens on Sam in the midst of quantum leaping, although instead of the usual talk with some vague otherworldly force, Sam gets a recap of both his pre-leap life and his experiences leaping, mentioning various episodes from the show, also super helpful for me, since I haven't watched the show all the way through in ages and needed the refresher. Well, I guess I know what I'm doing when I'm done filming this review. Sam wonders when he'll be able to return home, but the response is simply a feeling of not yet. Eventually, the leaping ends, and Sam finds himself in chainmail armor and is quickly identified as Sir Percival of York, who is about to joust against Lord Ranulph. Given that Sam doesn't know how to joust, this leads into the requisite oh boy moment. Unlike all the other novels, at least the ones I've read, this one features a recurring bit from the show, Sam's internal monologue as he gives his thoughts at the beginning of a leap. And I know analysis is usually at the end, but it is incredible how I can hear the narration perfectly, as if I've heard Scott Bakula reading it on the show. Naturally, Sam isn't actually in the 15th century, since he can only leap within his own lifetime, but he's never really sure when it comes to quantum leaping. But he isn't. Instead, he's participating in a medieval LARP in July of 1987. That is, live-action role-playing for the uninitiated. Although the novel doesn't use the term, it's more than a Renaissance fair because it isn't open to the public, and it's a group of people getting together and pretending that they're in the Middle Ages, so it's a LARP in my book. And Sam has leapt into the body of Philip Larkin, a name familiar to him even through Swiss Cheese memory, since he was a scientist who invented the Larkin capacitor, a device that's part of the framework of the computer systems at Project Quantum Leap. Unfortunately, like Chameleon on Doctor Who, they don't know much about the device for troubleshooting purposes because Larkin died soon after inventing it, which seems to be what Sam is there to prevent. Like any time Sam leaps into something related to his life, Sam immediately begins trying to work on fixing his own personal problem, and searches Philip's tent for any evidence of the Larkin capacitor's plans, although Al reminds him that the chances are pretty slim since the capacitor wasn't invented for another few years. What Sam does find, however, is a manuscript for a fantasy novel. A fantasy novel that Ziggy says was published by Roger Franks, the civilian identity of Lord Ranulph, and published by a New York publishing house after it was bought during the LARP by Cynthia, aka Lady Cindaria of the Chimes, a woman for whom both Philip and Roger are vying for the affections of. The manuscript and the published book are very different, with Philip's being absolute garbage according to Sam, and Roger's being great with marked changes. Did Roger steal Philip's idea? Did the reverse happen? And did Roger's publishing of the manuscript and eventually marrying Cynthia lead to Philip's untimely death? What's the deal? Unfortunately, things are complicated slightly when, later on, after confronting Cynthia with Philip's manuscript and accusing Roger of stealing the story, which Roger wholeheartedly denies, Sam discovers that Cynthia isn't actually Cynthia at all, nor is she Lady Cindaria of the Chimes. She's Alia, who has leapt in to wreak havoc, and since a necessary component for the project is on the line, it's pretty imperative for Sam that she fails. Alia, in the guise of Cynthia, decides that the only way to decide who is telling the truth vis-a-vis the manuscript is an old-fashioned medieval duel, which the other members of the group, particularly the member playing the king, think is a smashing idea, and the duel is scheduled for the following morning. Not quite Solomon's wisdom, but it'll do. Sam confronts Alia, but she plays it very cool, telling Sam of how hopeless it is, and how they'll never be free to return to their own lives, forced to continue their travels ad infinitum. Ostensibly, it's to break Sam's spirit to allow Alia's mission to succeed, but if you're a fan of the show, you know one thing about Sam, and why I've referenced Man of La Mancha twice so far. It's because Sam is Don Quixote, chasing the impossible dream, and never, even in the darkest times, loses hope. But he also wants to get a win for himself once in a while, and he won't stop trying to save Alia, no matter how hopeless it looks, or how much it looks like she doesn't want to be saved. And based on her interactions with Zoe in this book, it definitely seems like she's into it, which is the impression that I got from her first episode, so it tracks. However, it puts Sam in a tricky situation, because he doesn't want to see Alia hurt. He believes that she's a good person, stuck in a bad situation, and if Sam defeats her, she'll be punished again, which Sam doesn't want to take responsibility for, so Al has to call in the big guns to get him back, reminding him what quantum leaping is really about. It's not about obligation, winning, losing. It's about doing what's right, no matter the personal cost. So he tells him about his brother Tom. In the original history, Sam's brother Tom was killed in Vietnam, but Sam leaped in and saved him. And now in their time, Tom has grandchildren that wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for Sam doing what he did. And Sam has to do what he has to and put the needs of the many over the needs of the few. There's also a third aspect of this story with Donna back at Project Headquarters, who has taken it upon herself, for Sam's benefit whenever he returns, to recap the events of the Leaps, like Watson did for Sherlock Holmes, but admits that the changing history that only Sam and Al are aware of is very tricky for her. I mean, imagine believing that Jackie Kennedy died because of cancer in 1994, only to be told one day that she'd actually been assassinated alongside her husband in 1963, saved only because of Sam. And you think the Berenstain Mandela effect stuff is bad. This leap is particularly hard for her because it's so close and because of the ramifications it has, but also for the reasons every leap is hard for her, having to look at her husband's face and knowing that he isn't inside. In this case, however, Philip Larkin is a pretty good substitute, since he's taking the leaping stuff fairly well, and actually wants to work on the capacitor for them to help Sam, although the project rules don't really allow him to do that. But he does have a nice chat with Donna, which, if the second Evil Leaper episode is any indication, in which Al had to force a psychological breakthrough with a college student with a Batman complex, certain elements of which will persist, and the Philip who returns decides that he's going to make time for what's important in life, and not miss out on all the important things, like finding love. At the duel, Al tells Sam that Ziggy's calculations are pretty firm. If Sam wins the duel, Philip lives, he marries Cynthia, but the capacitor, which I remind you was a key element of Quantum Leap, is invented a year later, which means it could throw the timeline into utter disarray. But if he loses the duel in the new history, Cynthia doubts Roger enough not to marry him after buying the manuscript, but she doesn't end up with Philip, and Philip still dies after inventing the capacitor, although early enough for the project. Meanwhile, Alia is having Zoe, Thames, and Lothos work on a special surprise for Sam for the duel, which includes Alia purchasing a replica Morningstar to be used later, which is a variant of a mace, although no one can really agree on what it is. Some say that it's just the hilt with a spike ball attached to the end, while others, including this book, take the opinion that it's a type of flail with a hilt attached to a chain attached to a spike ball. I'd argue against historical inaccuracy, but this is a group of LARPers, so artistic license, I suppose. During the duel, Sam tries to talk Roger down to no avail, because the male ego is a disease, while the crowd goes wild. When Sam grabs onto Roger's arm, still trying to talk him down, Alia springs her trap, and has Lothos leap her into Roger, allowing her access to a chance to kill Sam. They fight, but Alia isn't nearly as adept as Roger, or even as adept as Sam, so she has to rely on cheating, pulling out the Morningstar. Told you it'd be used later. But even that isn't enough, and Sam knocks her off balance, so she just tries to strangle Sam. But Alia is soon knocked out with her own Morningstar, since Cynthia, the real Cynthia, post-return, decided to stop the fight herself. As she goes off to the League doctor to check on who she thinks is Roger, and Alia remarks that she couldn't free herself by killing, nor could Sam free her by killing her, and tells Sam what color his eyes are, as she's taunted him earlier about how long it had been since Sam had seen his own face in the mirror before she leaps, leaving Sam behind once more. Roger, since quantum leaping means the injuries go to the leaper and not the leapee, is fine, and with the original Cynthia and Roger both finally back, the truth finally comes out. The story they were fighting over was the brainchild of both Philip and Roger. They worked on it together, but their feelings for Cynthia got in the way, and Philip's manuscript is the first draft, which is terrible because Philip isn't really a writer, but also because he based a character on Cynthia. But in the attempt for historical accuracy, the two personalities clashed with the modern career woman and the medieval woman. Roger rewrote it, and that's his version, where the character Lady Alex is much more accurate to the time and less like Cynthia. The two of them decide to split the royalties, and history is saved, with Philip and Cynthia getting together and Roger marrying the actress who would play Lady Alex in the film adaptation, both having families, so all is well that ends well. But before Sam leaves, he notices the Morningstar laying in the grass and a familiar feeling, since the way it turned in the air made a shape not unlike the shape of a certain capacitor, which Sam leaves for Philip to see when he returns as Sam leaps away. In the waiting room, Donna and Sammy Jo Fuller, who is kinda sorta Sam's daughter, long story, not enough time to get into it, find that Philip is gone and in his place is a young IDF soldier from the 6 Days War. And I just can't seem to get away from books unintentionally referencing current events this year, can I? I swear I'm not doing this on purpose. But the important thing is, Philip isn't gone for long, although he took the long way around. In the revised history, Philip is alive and well, and is working to help Project Quantum Leap figure out any kinks in the Morningstar capacitor that might be preventing Sam's return home, although both he and Donna know that it probably isn't a tech problem. And the novel ends with Sam back in the space between leaps, as he discusses things with whatever vague force is causing the leaps, as it informs Sam that the leaps will end when the only life that Sam needs to fix is his own, when returning home would no longer be selfish, but selfless. The literary lair will return, but first, a word from our sponsor. Obviously, we love print media here at Black Scarab Films, but we also love books in all of their forms, including audio. I'm a fairly recent convert to the world of audiobooks, first when it provided me a way to read books during my commute, despite not having a free hand to turn pages with. And now, I've found audiobooks very useful for doing other tasks that would have usually prevented me from indulging in my favorite pastime, like when I'm folding laundry, cooking a meal, or even walking the dog. Gotta love multitasking, right? Which is why it's so fortunate that this episode is sponsored by Audible.com. If you love books and want to find a way to read more even when you don't have a free hand, audiobooks are the way to go. And if you like my channel and want to help support my videos, you can go to this link, audibletrial.com/BlackScarabFilms, to get a 30-day free trial and 1 free audiobook. My personal recommendation this month is I Must Say, My Life as a Humble Comedy Legend, written and narrated by Martin Short. Even if you aren't a fan of Short, I guarantee that you'll love this audiobook, because when I started listening to it, I wasn't a fan of Martin Short either, and now he's one of my favorite actors of all time. But if that's not your taste, there are literally thousands of audiobooks on Audible, so I'm sure you'll find something to your liking. Happy listening, and that link again is audibletrial.com/BlackScarabFilms. Quantum Leap Knights of the Morningstar is a fantastic novel, both as a Quantum Leap tie-in and as a sword and sorcery novel, even if there isn't really any real sorcery, or swords either, since they're replica. But still, I've said it before, I don't usually like fantasy or anything really medieval historical inspired. I like sci-fi, which is super helpful because while Sam references Errol Flynn while doing his sword fighting, he also references Luke Skywalker, so I understood how he was describing the fight. Though I'd be lying if I said this book didn't make me want to buy a replica sword. Melanie Ron might not be the usual Quantum Leap novel writer, nor did she write any other Quantum Leap novels, but this one is so great that I'm a little glad she didn't, because nothing can compare to this. It's both great as something that could have been an episode, but also great as something that couldn't have been. The 3 storylines would have been very tricky to do even in a 3-parter, but they all get the proper time here, and it's nice to really dig into Donna, who never really got a fair shake on the show, only appearing twice, and by different actresses both times. She's not even in the finale, but Ron builds on her character here in a way that makes me care about her more than I ever did before. Since we're allowed to truly get into how it feels for her, we know how leaping affects Sam and Al, but seeing how it affects Donna really puts it into perspective. Al gets to see Sam every leap. Sam has the benefit of Switchy's memory, making it so that he can't really miss home all the time, because he can't really remember it unless something triggers it, but Donna doesn't have either, and it hurts her. And all the characters are written really well. Sam and Al are perfectly in character. Even Sam's arguments with Al are reminiscent of arguments that they'd had any time Sam tried to help himself within a leap, even if it wasn't the mission. And getting to know Philip was fun too, since we don't usually meet the actual leapee unless it's important, and getting to know Philip made me want Sam to succeed even more, not just for the capacitor, but to allow Philip to get his happily ever after. Alia is a tricky character, because even having rewatched the entirety of the Evil Leaper trilogy as preparation for this review, I'm still not entirely sure what her deal is. She's evil, but she's not, although it seems that Lothos choosing unwilling leapers for his project is foolhardy, because someone like Zoe, who is unrepentantly evil, seems like a much better choice, since she wouldn't flinch being told she had to kill someone, and would delight in destroying history, whereas someone unwilling would go against orders and attempt escape. And they try to explain her deal in her next two appearances, which again takes place post-Morningstar in the loose excuse for a canon between novels, comics, and TV shows. Remember Belozario's maxim, don't examine this too closely, but the story never really quite lands, and maybe if they hadn't been cancelled, we might have figured out what the deal was, potentially with the free Alia being able to explain everything to Sam on the subsequent leap. But as it stands, But Melanie Ron does really well with it here. Because while, yes, unfortunately, it's a bit of a rehash of what happened in the latter half of Deliver Us from Evil, because it takes place in between Alia's first and second appearances in the show, and the second appearance is where most of the character development happened, but it's still pretty effective, and Alia here is used more in the service of advancing Sam's character, and his desire to save everyone, even evil people, and even those who don't want to be saved. Zoe, while we don't get as much of her as we do in subsequent appearances, is written very well, and her unabashed evil works really well next to Alia's seeming reluctant evil. But what I really like about the book, above all, are all the little bits of Sam's narration, which I can't remember how they went in the previous books, but these are especially in character, and I can hear Scott Bakula saying them, and that bit where Al talks about Sam's brother Tom is incredibly poignant, because we knew he survived in the show, but little else, and this makes Sam's work even more touching. The pacing was fantastic, and I never felt bored while reading it, even though it did take me a while to read it because I've been having trouble, sitting down and finding time to read a book when I have, my computer and so many other things to do, instead of reading on my commute as I did pre-pandemic. But I never felt bored while reading it. And in fact, I was just reading a few chapters a day, but as I neared the end of the book, I had more and more trouble putting the book down, and while I say trouble, it really wasn't a problem because I was enjoying it so much. My final verdict is that Knights of the Morningstar is one of the best Quantum Leap tie-ins out there, and manages to make sense of the mangled convolution that was the Evil Leaper storyline, enough to make a highly enjoyable novel that I recommend to anyone who likes Quantum Leap. It's exactly like an episode of the show, but somehow even better. I can't in good faith direct you to it if it's your first exposure to Quantum Leap. I definitely recommend some of the earlier novels, maybe Quantum Leap the novel. But if you're already invested in the characters, this is a must-read. In fact, I like it so much that I'm actually considering checking out the aforementioned Dragon Prince novel just because I love Melanie Ron's style so much, and in the absence of other Quantum Leap novels written by her, I have to delve into her fantasy work. Who knows, maybe I'll even look at it on the show one day. But until then, I'll see you next time.